It's more than 25 years ago that I joined the National Institute of Adult Education. I was called director then before the great inflation of name titles filled in. And about the first thing I had to do when I was there, we were small, was to supervise a research project looking at provision for adults with learning difficulties across England and Wales, a bit of Scotland. And frankly, most of it was pretty limited, if not dire. People were, by and large, given things to do with a very, very, come in, a very narrow curriculum range. Art, woodwork if you were lucky, bit of horticulture. And one of Jeannie Sutcliffe, who did the works, student she was talking to, and one of the places she went to visit, they said they'd asked the student what he wanted to do and expected the sort of normal kind of answers. And he answered, I want to learn Jesus and history and thunder and lightning. And that was 1988. And actually it stuck with me all the time since, because it's not a bad touchstone for how it ought to be that people can have chances through their lives to remake themselves, to understand, to be curious about science, to work out where they sit on the issues, the great issues around faith and aesthetics. And that, not a bad way of saying, well, what have we got now by comparison? And it's absolutely not, in his answer, I want something that will give me a sense of dignity through work. That's absolutely vitally important, but it's not enough for a life. And I mean, broadly, what I want to say in the talk, to echo a remark of Bob Dylan's, is it's not just what we think they need that we need to think about, but exactly what they want, you know. And so I want to argue that adult learning of all sorts matters. It changes people's lives. It establishes the opportunities for them to have new enthusiasms. Now then, how do I get this to work? This is one thing to have it there, quite another to... new enthusiasms. These women, Serbian grannies, living in a very poor place. They've got access to a laptop and they've just learned Skyping, and so they can talk to their great-grandchildren in Adelaide. They're sitting outside some in a village outside Belgrade. In addition to new passions and new enthusiasms, of course, it touches on old curiosities. This is Fred Moore, who was the oldest learner in England at 108 when we found him, who studied art and French in a home in New Milton in Hampshire. And, well, for me, he represents the aspiration that you might be mildly curious when you get on. Here are a bunch of Brighton dustmen who decided together, collectively, that they could do something about reading and writing and not be embarrassed about it in a way that each of them individually said they would never have had a go. So it's also second chances and conviviality, people finding ways of making sense of the world. Adult learning, when it's coordinated publicly, offers chances for people from different walks of life, different backgrounds, to make sense of what's going on. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But of course, it's also got very positive health effects in family learning. You know, the African proverb about you teach a woman and her children learn, teach a bloke, nothing much happens. I don't think they write that down. But also, what I've been involved with the International League for Social Commitment, there's absolutely no doubt that it also has a catalytic effect on all sorts of other social policy goals. You don't get improvements in HIV/AIDS unless people learn how the principles have an impact for their own behaviour. The same thing about infant mortality and clean water. But it's also true in our own world of work, that mental health is strengthened through engagement with the possibility of remaking relationships where the world doesn't fall down if you don't feel well enough to go next Thursday. So, I haven't quite reached him yet, but we'll leave him up there in case you have a chance to read it. There is, though, a problem. It does all these wonderful things, but actually it just reinforces disadvantage if you're not careful. That is, you have to actively think about who isn't there and what can be done about it. And I suppose that's more or less a limited question I spent my life worrying about. And I found when I was doing this talk, I've done a lot of work for this talk. It's the same old stuff I've always said at the end of it. I suppose it confirms it. You have that sort of sense of, you know, as your mind begins to go, if you could recover what you used to think, it's not a bad thing, is it? So I hope you'll forgive me if it works out like that this evening. But the present situation is desperate. We're eradicating opportunities for adults to learn. 2 million adults lost since 2003. You read 1 million in the press a lot because people only ever talk about the length of their own government. But actually, since we began producing an annual neurotic skills strategy year on year, we've lost 2 million people from the further education system, and goodness knows the cuts to come in the next 3 or 4 years will get rid of the rest of them. The OU has lost 30% of its students since the fees arrangements were changed in HE, in a booming HE economy, and mature and part-time mature students, both at undergraduate and postgraduate level, overall down 40% in higher education. And the nonsense in an ageing society where we need people to work longer of not allowing people to have any public support for studying at the same or a lower level than they've achieved previously, the ELQ level, is bizarre. I can tell you the benefits of going back to work after serious retirement because I'm enjoying it, more or less, most of the time anyway. Public policy affecting adult learning is unstable. Feast is followed very often by, well, always, by prolonged famine in the area. As soon as a policy works, there's a panic that it's going to cost too much and you close it down. Individual learning accounts is only one illustration of that. Look at the policies in the last 15 years we've had about migrants or English for speakers of other languages. The economy needs migration, but there's a sort of moral panic as well as a politically unacceptable panic about treating people as human beings with a right to understand the society in which they're participating. OECD's major survey, internationally comparative survey on 16 to 64-year-olds, which looked at their literacy skills, numeracy skills, and information processing, argued at the end that the results underline the very clear need to move from a reliance on initial education towards fostering lifelong skills-oriented learning. Well, yes, but. Or yes and, rather, not but. Fe Barlona from last week, I've progressed. Skills are, of course, vital, but beyond that, the wider aspirations, and more importantly, really, the interconnectedness of learning focused vocational skills alongside all the other skills that make us human and make all that time we spend at work tolerable, really. So the link between the two, and now finally I come to David Blunkett, who wrote a preface to an otherwise human capital-driven document. If you read the paper behind the preface to The Learning Age, it's full of all the mantras of learning for short-term measurable economic outturns. But he said learning enables people to play a full part in their community, strengthens the family, the neighbourhood, and consequently the nation. It helps us fulfil our potential and opens doors to a love of music, art, and literature. That's why we value learning for its own sake and are encouraging adults to enter and re-enter learning at every point of their lives, as parents, at work, and as citizens. So I've finished now. I could sit down, but since that's not what you do, I'm going to bang on a little bit longer. I wanted to go back from there to say, what was extraordinary about that observation and the period in the mid-1990s when a commitment to lifelong and life-wide learning seemed to flower in Britain? Really, if you take it from the First World War period onwards, you've got basically benign neglect from central government and creativity coming either from the voluntary or municipal sector. This is an early WEA gathering in Oxford, but the WEA was funded and universities were funded post-1980 after the First World War, creating not only homes fit for heroes but brains fit for heroes as well. But during the interwar period, municipal education, which was given permission in that period, grew. But the state had nothing to say about things until you get to the Second World War, when the Army Bureau of Current Affairs was created on the basis that if people understood the society they were fighting for, they would be more disciplined and focused in doing the fighting, and that it would be inspirational to them. That was set up by one of my predecessors at the National Institute, it was then called the British Institute of Adult Education, who in his spare time set up did Penguin Books with Alan Lane, invented the Arts Council. I always felt inadequate as the director by comparison, really. And then the period after the war, there was again a kind of gentle increase in what went on. Increasingly middle class, to be honest, but a tripling of university work. And then Florence Horsburgh, then the Minister of, I think she might, anyway, she was the Minister of Education in a Conservative government, had the temerity to reduce modestly the university grants. The TUC wrote to the Prime Minister, Churchill, who, I mean, I've only used a bit of it, and it's too small for you to read it out. There is perhaps no branch of our vast education system which should more attract within its particular sphere the aid and encouragement of the state than adult education. How many must there be in Britain after the disturbance of two destructive wars who thirst in later life to learn about the humanities, the history of their country, the philosophies of the human race, and the arts and letters which sustain and are borne forward by the ever-conquering English language. I missed out the bit where he said science and technical wasn't so important. He goes on, the mental and moral outlook of free men studying the past with free minds in order to discern the future demands of the demands the highest pressure measures which our hard-pressed finances can sustain, and the appetite of adults to be shown the foundations and processes of thought will never be denied by a British administration cherishing the continuity of our island life. I sent that to Gillian Shepherd when she was Secretary of State. Yes, she said, very good, I'll use that. Anyway, so after Churchill, not surprising, he's really a prefigure as Jeremy Corbyn, doesn't he? Because he wasn't really into cabinet solidarity. The cut was reversed, and things poodled on. There was a commission every now and then, Ashby in 54, Russell in 73, A Case in 82, that wrote about adult or lifelong learning, but by and large they got ignored by government, and any developments were bottom-up innovations like literacy and ESOL on the one hand, like access courses in polytechnics on the other. But what happened in the mid-1990s is you suddenly get a stimulus to thinking harder about the role of lifelong learning, which begins in 1992 with an EU competitiveness white paper under the presidency of Jacques Delors in the EU. And that white paper argues that there's one answer to economic competitiveness for an ageing Europe and for social cohesion in a challengingly divided Europe, and the answer is lifelong learning in both cases. And then he moved very shortly after that. I mean, that set a whole process in place of developments, both in vocational and community-based education, a European Year of Lifelong Learning in '96, and it culminates with the Lisbon Strategy in 2000. helped by the Swedes and Danes joining the EU, and so societies where learning together was common sense got built into the European framework. But Delors' arguments in The Treasure Within, which was the next document he produced, he moved on to UNESCO, where he chaired a commission on lifelong learning, where he argued that really there are 4 pillars of learning all through your life: learning to know and learning to do, both of which we sort of know how to do with people. Learning to be, I mean, I always think to become would have been a better way of thinking about it, and learning to live together. I mean, so understanding ourselves in society as important as the more practical things. He agreed really with Thomas Carlyle, who said it's the first duty of government to see that the people can think, which I rather like. I found it in a Raymond Williams piece, and I couldn't be troubled to find the original. But Raymond Williams too is the same territory, and I've always found this an absolutely fundamental way of understanding our work as working with adults, that at times of change, adults turn to learning to understand what's going on, to make adjustments, adaptations in the light of it, but most importantly to shape change, and that any thinking about a life-wide strategy has to think about tiers of helping people move from understanding, adapting, but towards what you do to shape things. And of course, it helps in economic prosperity and in creating an informed democracy. But Delors' human rights approach also related really to the thinking of Freire and the idea that education is dialogical, that it's not a teacher taught, but something that's negotiated. We used to call it the negotiated curriculum before they changed the law in '92 and told us we could only have things approved by the state. It involves people working together, not acting on others. So the task, anyway, is reading the world, not just reading the word. How do you make sense of things? And really, in a way, Delors pulls together those strands of thinking. That's one major report that emerges in 1996. The same year, the OECD produces its report on lifelong learning, and that document makes the case for the link. It's the product of their education and labour departments, ministries, ministers from both strands. And of course, its argument is that there's no future for industrial societies other than through strengthening their human capital and through recognising that if you want to make a difference, you can't compete on the basis of wages and low skills. You don't have the world's range of raw materials. People are what we have, so we need to develop them. And that thinking of people as human capital came over time, of course, to be the absolutely dominant. And Shel Rubinson says it didn't only dominate the thinking in the industrial world, but increasingly in the developing countries too, a sense that you need to be able to show an economic outcome for investment in this area. What happens here over time is that the Treasury gets more interested. But just in the short run, there's an enormous flowering that goes on, which I thought was really rather exciting. I better not go back to that one yet. When Labour came to power, firstly, before the Labour Party came to power in '97, there was a real interest in lifelong education from the Conservative government at the time. It was cross-party concern to see how can we build on the education of young people, both second chances for people failed by the system, but also, energising a society towards a learning society. Gillian Shepherd was really interested in learning cities. Indeed, she came to our Adult Learners Week event and said, I want Thetford to be a learning city in 3 weeks. We said, well, we can do the learning. Actually, Thetford's quite small. For it to be a city in 3 weeks might be a bit hard, actually. But the idea was a powerful one. And then when Labour came to power, there were They had five, probably more, but I chose 5 reports that added to this OECD UNESCO dialogue, and by and large leaned it towards a generous and inclusive short-term view. Firstly, Deering, one of whose key principles is that universities have a responsibility for civic and inclusive societies. Then Kennedy, Helena Kennedy, whose wonderful mantra, invented by Tony Uden, my old colleague, but Helena made it famous, of if at first you don't succeed, you don't succeed, at the core of a paper about widening participation and the possibilities of that. Tomlinson, which Peter helped draft, or significantly drafted, on inclusive learning, to identify people with disabilities not as somebody you needed to make special provisions for, but that everybody needed to have provision fit for purposes for them and their needs, and that would inevitably then mean that those adjustments worked for not only for people with disabilities and learning difficulties, but for everybody in a better way. Josh Hillman's paper on the University for Industry, and a report John Field and I were both involved in, Bob Freire's report of the National Advisory Group for Continuing Education and Lifelong Learning, which advised about lifelong learning. So there was an enormous flowering that followed that. I mean, not surprising, but, and I should say, even more important than all that was Blunkett's understanding from his own life and his own biography and vision that lifelong, life-wide learning enhanced people's lives in the way that the one quote I've drawn up, well, you could have given half a dozen from that reference. Individual learning accounts, neighbourhood learning in deprived communities, University for Industry, the Skills for Life strategy, which made a big transformation. I mean, these things always come at a price. A national curriculum, proper training, but a national curriculum, and no longer the same loose and floppy stuff, fluffy stuff that was going on before. And work on older people, you know, including finding Fred. So all of that was led to a period between the mid-90s and the early 2000s where you thought, it's done and dusted. We've begun to move away from an initial education system towards a lifelong system. And the reason I chose Lifewide rather than lifelong is what happened subsequently. Lifelong got utterly colonised by the economic model, the model that said the only issues that significantly matter are those, the financially driven ones. Blunkett wasn't alone, of course, as a politician with a feel for the importance of these issues. John Denham was very good about self-organised groups. John Hayes was quite lyrical about craft and making culture, making things. And Vince Cable not only told a wonderful story about how his mum recovered dignity through adult classes after a breakdown, and his father found further education, an arena in which he could pass on his skills as an engineer, but he also went to the Treasury and made sure that in a time of really quite severe cuts in the short run, I'm afraid it was only the short run, there was some protection. At the end of Blunkett's era then, really the high watermark, I thought, of lifelong learning policy is the remit letter for the Learning and Skills Council. It captures absolutely the mutual and interplaying relationship between learning for personal, community, economic, industrial purposes. Of course, the trouble was the Learning and Skills Council was created in legislation that happened 2 weeks before Mr. Blunkett poodled off to the Home Office. And what followed was the appointment of a chair from BP for the new LSC and senior executives, none of whom thought any of that stuff mattered, so they pretended it wasn't in the remit. And you think these things are in law, but they're only in law if they beat upon the pulses of decision makers in such a way that they happen. So, I mean, realistically what happened was that the Treasury had become more and more interested in the questions, and their influence began to dominate, so that education and employment became subsidiary departments for the central economic task of the country. And it wasn't surprising that after people had gone on about willow weaving being useless or underwater basket weaving, that we got a remark from a man who otherwise I found very agreeable. I sat on these skills strategy government skills committees for about a decade, and Alan Johnson was delightful. But he said, oh, we tried adult education, it didn't work, much like the World Bank says about literacy. But what he said on this occasion from The Guardian is, we must rebalance taxpayers' money towards the subjects where there's greatest need. So more plumbing, less Pilates. Subsidise precision engineering, not over-subsidise flower arranging. Except, of course, with flower arranging, I have to tell you a little story that I once found a Brixton florist when they were moaning about flower arranging in Parliament. Brixton florist who'd been a merchant banker, got his industrial retraining at an evening class, hired half the class, and opened a glorious flower shop opposite the Tube in Brixton, right in the heart of where the riots had been. We got him written about in the paper, and within 3 weeks they were saying this stuff about, of course, we know it leads to floristry in Parliament. So he got an echo of that left. Tai Chi may be hugely valuable to people studying it, but it's of little value to the economy, he said. I can't resist telling you that Tom Wilson, who we just welcomed as a visiting research fellow in the faculty last week, at the time of this speech, had a plumber in doing work. Tom Wilson leads for the TUC, Union Learn, and he asked his plumber why plumbers don't take on apprentices. And the plumber said to him, well, he said, as soon as they finish qualifying, they're the competition, aren't they? So he said, so you wouldn't until you reach the age of 40 or a bit more, when getting under the bath gets harder and harder. He said, but I don't need to hire one. He said, because I do Pilates. And so back to the subject in hand, and lost my place in all that excitement. The kind of focus on human capital, as I'm arguing it, wins really for three kinds of reasons. One, there is an objectively challenging external world in which the economic, the technological and communications revolutions each present disruptive challenges to the way that we've done things before. Wonderful phrase of Charlie Ledbetter's, of people feeling that you're living on thin air, that you can't guarantee that what was done one week would be the same. So jobs everywhere affected by globalisation. And I thought, you can't really move the extractive industries, can't move all that uranium from Australia, well, except once you've dug it out. But for other things, commodities designed in Italy, produced in Vietnam, shipped by a Panamanian freighter, financed from London, marketed in New York, showing profits in the Cayman Islands, you can see why people wanted to work in the City of London, because it might, in the short run, look like a more secure form of employment. But the thing about all those things is they can all move at very short order if you get a better deal in another bit of the world. So it creates an insecurity that almost everybody has, except the globally mobile, whose rates of return, whose wealth rockets, while the rest of us, well, the rest of the people don't. I'll come to that in a moment. So the first argument, Gita Sen, a lovely piece, argues that this is a fierce new world that we're living in which we all feel vulnerable. The second reason is that national governments, of course, have less power to manage the economy that they're running, because global financial moves can shift things very quickly. The UK's conclusion about this is, well, let's not try. Let's let the market run as many things as possible, and let's regulate less than almost anybody else. There's an OECD quote I wanted here, which, again, in Skills Outlook, the survey they've done, they remark that at the country level, there's a clear relationship between the extent of participation in adult learning activities and average of proficiency in key information areas. But it also notes that adults maintain and enhance their skills better from learning undertaken outside the workplace. Learning leaks what you learn in one place you apply to another, and actually you learn it better when you're bringing it to a new place. So the logic for lifelong, let alone life-wide learning, is a very powerful one. But here the Treasury's view is that you get a better rate of return by investing in the young, so why would you waste limited resources on older folk, really? And then the third reason is that government doesn't regulate training, so that in the United States you've got twice the level of percentage of the workforce covered by levies, by the license to practice, where you need to learn in order to work, than we have in the UK. Most of our European competitors have tripartite arrangements which agree what the reasonable balance of the role, and most of them believe that employers should pay for training. And here we have a culture in which very many employers, 30% plus, don't train at all. So, and then on top of that, government sees this whole issue as about vocational qualifications. And what this chart I've had up for a bit shows you is why employers don't engage with a vocational qualifications-driven policy. That if you can only get government money if you're offering a vocational qualification, there's a kind of mismatch from the sort of business solutions that are... I'm a college governor in Cornwall, and it's really striking that the local economy wants people to be trained, but not trained quite as much as we have in a full qualification. And the challenges that poses to you about responding to what people want or responding to what you can get funded for is a real one. So they don't know about vocational qualifications. The government doesn't fund it. Vocational, I won't go on all the way through the list, but you can see that there's a wide degree of scepticism about fit between what employers want. That's from the UK Commission for Employment Skills survey. When you look at international comparisons, I'm not sure if you can all see this, but basically they show that if you look at participation in education and training between 2009 and 2014, 20 out of 28 EU countries have spent significantly, have engaged people in significantly larger numbers. The dynamic for training and development, for participation more widely, is very powerfully there. Look at Switzerland, already a well-educated community, 24 up to 31.7, but pretty much the only countries that haven't. The countries of the southern Mediterranean who've been absolutely devastated by economic collapse, and us who believe in austerity as a solution to what? It's hard to see how an economic and learning policy has us competitive in all those ways that the OECD was arguing simply on this sort of basis. And it gets worse. When you look at what employers have been doing training staff on or off site since 2003, you'll see that 2014 we're under any year up to the recession. Both in the middle column is education training they provide themselves, and the right-hand column is stuff they buy off-site. Not much from... this is mine. It's a phone that never rings. Tell you a story. I once was chairing Commissioner of Education in Europe, and I used to have the Just a Minute tune, you know, Chopin, on my... And he said, nice tunes. And I said, bad manners. So I'm sorry about that. So when you then look at international comparisons here about how much time do individuals who get a chance to train get the opportunity to learn. And you look at, this is the UK, and all the other countries do more. And if you took out induction training and health and safety training, we'd be even lower. So what is it about our culture that not only doesn't believe in... You see, to me, unless you've got a culture of life-wide learning, you almost certainly don't understand the power and weight of learning throughout your life. So I want to put it the other way around. Then the more you have, the more you get. So even that minuscule amount nearly all goes to people with higher levels of previous education. So tertiary, you're about 1 in 2 chance of having some training, and for people at the lowest levels, well under 1 in 5 over a period of time. And then not only do companies not give you a chance to train, but individuals internalise it, and they don't do it either. So what we've got is a kind of deep social Darwinism going on about learning, really. And so what's the result of all this? The OECD says that, from the survey, that if you look at 55 to 64-year-olds, Britain comes in England and Northern Ireland. The Welsh and Scots decided it was too dangerous to join in this. Britain came in the top 3 of the older workforce in terms of the skills they've got across these areas, and in the bottom 3 for 15 to 24, 16 to 24-year-olds. And the 16 to 24-year-olds have been through an education system the whole time, tested, inspected, delimited by a national curriculum. And lo and behold, when you look at the 10 years, with the highest levels of skills in that area, it's the Plowden years, when people let everything hang out. Now, there's something deeply counterindicative about this. It's hard to measure, it doesn't fit audit culture, but learning isn't tidy. And that's my long-winded general point. If you ask people how they like to learn at work, actually courses are a late decision. Mostly you do it by trial and error, or you ask a mate, or you even ask your boss, and then eventually go, all right, I'll go on a course. It's very interesting from a NIAS survey that we did with Lorna's colleagues, with Lorna and her colleagues at the Centre for Labour Market Studies at Leicester at the time. I want to move on now to work on the wider benefits of learning, where, and I decided, and so the stories I normally tell, to use the BIS report on what was defensively measured in a 2012 summary. And they argue that you can show real gains in mental health, mental well-being, some in physical, and more modest ones in other things I'll come to. So you're happier. I know one of the lovely stories is everybody gets more miserable as they get older, up to a point, but people who do learning are a bit less miserable than everybody else. I like that. In fact, I think after 42 it gets better every year, so I'm well aware. Improvements in self-confidence, which is more than twice the impact of being employed, extraordinarily enough. Join in learning, it's better for you. Improvements in perceptions of self-worth, less self-reported depression, increase in satisfaction with social life, and in the use of your leisure time. And then in physical health, you don't go to the GP so often, you have overall health satisfaction, and that's only half as good as being employed. So being employed is better for your physical health. I find that hard to believe, but it's apparently true. Family and parenting, well, you know, it increases the probability that children will talk to you about difficult things, is what they discovered. And then on civic participation, if you do formal learning, you're more likely to join a trades union, and if you do formal learning, you're also more likely to be involved in voluntary work. But the greater desire to find a better job comes from informal learning. So again, there's a mismatch, interesting one, from where our policies are. And then, curiously, improve financial expectations. What I've been trying to do was well captured by Tom Schuller and his colleagues in the Centre for Widening Benefits of Learning, Wider Benefits of Learning, in the idea that you look at human capital, social capital, and identity capital, sense of worth and confidence and so on, and that there's an interplay between all these things that isn't well served by concentrating your investment in a rather narrow way. Then you move on and you find participation has an impact on whether you're likely to do it again. This is from this year's NIAS, unpublished NIAS survey about the future. Current learners, 83% of them think they'll be doing something in the next couple of years. only 17% not. And in a beautiful symmetry, people who say they've done no learning since school, 17.5% of them think, well, I might do something. And more than 8 in 10 say, no thanks. So you have a real challenge about, to those, not only do we make more provision for people who've had more, but it's also more obviously wanted by people who've had more. And you can show the same, I won't, because I think basically that's the same as the ISCED one before, that you've got a social division where ABs, professional managerial people, learn in spades, and people from the lowest social classes don't. I wanted to show you something about the difference in ageing. Tom Schuller and his colleagues did a, it's about time I stopped, but I'll go on just a bit longer. Tom Schuller and his colleagues did a really interesting analysis in the Learning Through Life of the 4 post-school ages and stages of learning. So broadly, up to 25, ever more complex routes towards the labour market, and learning is in and out to do with that. 25 to 50, overloaded. Jobs, family, busy social life, complexity, and learning has to be squeezed in the edges. 50 to 75, underloaded. You've got kind of gradually withdrawing from the labour market, busy running civil society, but often beginning to be lonely too. I mean, different agenda. And then from 75 onwards, dealing with the gradual domestication of your life as the busy external period for people at different times changes. And what this survey did was to just pick up, if you take the population as a whole, what do people, what are they learning? And then you start doing the splits of 45 plus or 55 plus. What you see is the agenda of learning for Jesus and history and thunder and lightning comes out more and more as people, as the early urgent needs of the labour market diminish. And in a similar way, if you look at motivation to learn, I'm sorry about the light with these things, but you've got a rising interest in personal development as you get older and in having pleasure in learning, and a diminishing interest in defining yourself in relation to the world of your work. Now, you could argue that this is all a threnody for an earlier era, and that arguing for the value of life-wide learning at a time when we're facing the collapse of provision altogether is bonkers, especially if you look at just how much creative work there is outside of the paid service, the thriving of the universities of the third age. You can't pick up The Guardian without being invited to a masterclass of some kind. Saga has these learning cruises on offer, and if the provision's basically for the already educated, why worry is the kind of argument you might provide. But there's also MOOCs thriving away. There's expert patient groups where you can know more than your doctor about Parkinson's by negotiating on the web. I mean, there is a wide culture of learning. I don't know, John here, there's a Lincolnshire Bat Observation Society he once wrote about, always struck me as sort of an illustration of the extremely diverse forms of learning opportunity that people have. And of course, the reasons why that's not good enough to lean on are threefold. One, because actually the public interest in making sure that learning is accessible to everybody, not merely the early adopters and the confident, is a public concern and an interest. Secondly, you do need the state to accelerate initiatives that work. So the literacy scheme grew out in the 70s, grew out of the voluntary sector and the BBC, but it wouldn't have happened on the scale it did until the state invested in it. And the third area, which you're bound to say in a university like this one, is the splendours of having properly trained professional staff who are properly remunerated, also probably relies on state regulation at the minimum, but also in intervention. So, central problem I've worried about is, if learning is so good for everybody, why do the people who don't come not see the point. Talking to someone along the way, and again, I couldn't quite find the place, who said, I can see it's got all these merits, but it's not really for the likes of me. Now, what do you do about that? In the end, finding constructive mechanisms for engagement require patience and time. We were struck by David Browning when Northern College opened, spending 3 years wandering around miners' clubs and so on, and women's organisations, patiently saying, what could we do for you in our new centre? And of course, absolutely the strongest institution for those links now. But you can't help think that audit culture doesn't have the patience to wait for the level of outreach that really does make a difference to some. I began my work in the Friends Centre in Brighton. The first week I was there, Glub Pasha, who was a general at the time of 1948 creation of the State of Israel, who'd been seconded to lead the Jordanian forces. And there were 70 people in the audience, including retired permanent secretaries of the Foreign Office. I thought, cool, what have I wandered into here? And then a little later there was, as part of the kind of social action dimensions to adult learning, we had a Ruskin History Women's Workshop Overspill conference at the Friends Centre, and I had to ask a group called Should We Shoot Marx and Freud if they would move mind-moving rooms, because they'd outstayed their entitlement. It was one of the hardest things I ever had to do in my life. I was also running the creche with my daughter's here, who was in it too. I was talking to somebody, and she came in, it was only my children in the room. Play with the kids! So, it was a good time. And I see the links between that second wave feminism using adult education as a place to develop and engender new knowledges before it got sucked into higher education. When I moved to London, taxi drivers' knowledge of millinery, you would never know, was kind of fundamental to West Indian women's church culture, that you make a new hat every week. Cake decorating, to backdoor economies of people selling the things they'd made in classes to maintain some degree of economic independence. You can't tell the purpose of the class from the title of the course. And Norman Dees, any class worth its salt can disguise its essential soul from any external observer. And every time I see an inspector, I say that too. What I've got up here from 1919 is that voluntary organisations have a fundamental role to play. There's no doubt that you can't imagine all the things people will want to know. And we need a dialogue, an engagement, a working across the boundaries. But many of the things I've been trying to talk about imply working outside silos. And silos are difficult for central government. And it seems to me that our solution, and it's a powerful one here in the West Midlands, is to think about the learning city, about the sub-regional area as one in which people have an intimacy of contact to be able to pool resources and make a difference to change things. This is from Haiti. Adult learning can absolutely transform lives. After the earthquake, civil administration gone, developers arrived stealing your land rights too. Adult education there, in my work in Kai, was about barefoot legal workers defending people's legal rights. In this one, after the tsunami in the Philippines, is how do people whose communities have been completely destroyed rebuild a sense of identity together as they dig out the difference. The World Social Forum is full, 60,000 people a year, of people imagining a different way of organising the world. These things are adult education too, and I suppose in my career they've been the things that fire me. Harbins-Bowler makes the distinction between registers, structures, the well-behaved side of adult education as structure, with saying there's adult education as culture, banging the drums for attention and running well, I've always been in favour of this, and that's why, following his advice, we ran Adult Learners Week. This is Augusta Boal with the Theatre of the Oppressed, where anyone can get to run the class, and the minute they get fed up with you, they tell you to sit down. And this, I think, is blissfully my last slide about the effects of learning, again from the benefits of learning. It can transform lives, collectively and individually, but it can also sustain us. And I'm sorry I took so much of your time, but thank you for having me.